Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us in today's panel webinar, Employee Legal Rights During COVID-19.
So in terms of worker rights, the key rights that are established in all occupational health and safety legislation, no matter what jurisdiction you're in, is the right for employees to be able to participate in the health and safety process, in developing policies and procedures, in identifying risks in the workplace, and then also the right to refuse dangerous work. And this is probably where we see the greatest impact of COVID. So employees do have the right to refuse dangerous work, but they only have that right when there is reasonable cause to believe there is imminent danger in the workplace. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that, and Simon's going to answer some questions around that once we move forward. And then the third right that workers really have is the right to know about potential hazards. So all of the systems that are in place in any particular workplace are geared towards protecting these rights of employees and workers. The employer, on the other side, has a responsibility to make sure that workers are aware of the hazards that are associated with their occupations, to ensure they know what duties they have and what their rights are. So posting occupational health and safety legislation where it's visible, WHMIS, workplace health material safety data sheets, and those kinds of things have to be available. So that's really standard operating procedure for a lot of different workplaces. And each workplace is unique in terms of the kinds of hazards that are there and the kinds of information that needs to be made available to the workers. And it's occupation dependent as well. What a janitorial worker might need to know in a hospital is quite different, obviously, than what a healthcare worker, nurse, or doctor might need to know, and what risks they might be exposed to. So the employer is also responsible for creating those policies and procedures and providing personal protective equipment if it's required. They are also required to provide information and training as well as supervision, particularly where the risks are higher. Violence prevention is another responsibility for employers, and I think that this is coming up as an issue around COVID as well, because we are seeing concerns where perhaps customers are reacting negatively to employees who are asking them or requiring them to wear personal protective equipment when they are objecting to it. And so employers are having to attend to that concept or that idea of how they prevent violence in those kinds of circumstances. So training employees becomes particularly important there as well. Employers are required to cooperate with occupational health and safety officers if a complaint is filed or if there's a work refusal. That's part of the role of the employer, and maintaining records, of course, and then reporting illness or injury. So reporting any kind of an outbreak of an illness would also be required of the employer. There's a COVID-related a certain number of cases, and I believe it's 5. At least in Alberta, I think it's 5 cases that counts as an outbreak. So that might be different for each different province. So the next thing we're actually going to talk about is workers' compensation. So this is another area where people have a lot of questions around whether or what happens when someone might have contracted COVID from the workplace. And so just to give a little bit of brief background about workers' compensation, it's basically an employer-funded insurance scheme. So employers pay into the workers' compensation scheme just like you would for any other type of insurance, car insurance that you have, house insurance, where you pay your fees and the insurance protects you should an incident occur. So it works the same way for workers' compensation. Not all employers have to pay for insurance through workers' compensation. There are exceptions in each province that are somewhat unique, but in order, most large and high-risk employers certainly are required to provide WCB to their employees. So essentially what happens is it's a no-fault compensation system where if an employee gets injured or sick while at work, then workers' compensation supports that employee. Their salary is paid for, their health care follow-up is paid for through that insurance scheme. The exchange for that really is, there's a bit of a trade-off. So in order to have that compensation and to go that workers' compensation scheme, the trade-off is that employees have no right then to sue their employer for workplace-related injuries or illnesses. The really big question that often is asked, and I think the public is less aware of these fine distinctions, but the issues that often arise in workers' compensation cases are whether or not the disability has actually been caused by or exacerbated by work. So if it has been, that is normally compensable, but sometimes that's really hard to tell the difference, right? Whether something's an occupational or a non-occupational injury. And if you think about stress-related injuries, for example, you may have been doing the same kind of job for multiple employers, and over time you have put stress because you've been on a part of your body because you know it might be a repetitive strain kind of an injury, and that injury, it's very hard to distinguish at what point it arose and at what point it becomes compensable, or whether or not it arose because of the workplace. You shoveled your, you've got back pain, a back injury, you can't work, or did it happen because of what you do in your job? Because all of us are sitting in chairs, I think, more than we used to be because of COVID. Did it occur because of that, or did it occur because you shoveled your driveway the week before? And so teasing out those distinctions is often where we see disputes around workers' compensation, whether or not someone is eligible to get it, to get compensation. So there are certainly presumption for certain occupations and health conditions. So there are certain health conditions related to having worked in a coal mine, and that's automatically assumed to be compensable if the person has that a particular type of cancer related to coal dust. There is a presumption in most provinces now with respect to stress or post-traumatic stress disorder related to first responders. So people, police, firefighters, paramedics, those on the front lines, often there's a presumption related to, if they have that condition, it is assumed to have been related to the occupation because the occupation is inherently stressful or high risk. So that is basically what workers' compensation is about. And employers are required to report, and it affects their rating. So sometimes they're a little uncomfortable or don't want to report when illnesses and injuries come, because then their insurance rates basically go up, like it would for your home insurance or your car insurance if you have an accident. So they are required to report, but I think that there are sometimes questions around when they, you know, sometimes things go a little underground and they choose not to report, let's put it that way, if they can avoid it because of the impact on their you know, on their rates. So with respect to COVID, workers' compensation, both in Alberta and BC, and I didn't pull up Ontario or legislation from other provinces, but I thought I'd look at these. It's essentially what workers' compensation is saying is that if the type of work that a person is engaged in, if their employment creates an additional risk of contracting COVID that's greater than what an ordinary exposure would be for someone who's in the public at large, then that is compensable. So if the employment involves exposure to the source of an infection, the nature of employment is the cause of the condition, or creates greater risk of exposure for the worker. So those are the kind of situations where that presumption will be made with respect to compensability, or whether or not someone is eligible at compensation for COVID. And I think that we are not seeing the cases, so many cases just yet, but I think that this is where we're going to see a lot of activity as well, whether or not COVID is related to the workplace. I think we're going to see some legal cases coming forward here.
Okay, so just a quick summary on human rights. So in both provinces, we've got a human rights code, and there's protection against certain forms of discrimination. We don't have the actual discrimination ground of creed in BC. I guess there is in in Alberta, and I actually had to look up creed last night and what that is. So yeah, I know it's been a while. So anyways, the whole issue around human rights, just to summarize it, is imagine that someone has a type of a medical condition which doesn't allow them to, say, wear a mask or to be vaccinated. It could be a medical condition, it could be a religious reason, and we're trying to balance that worker's right to say express their religious freedoms versus the employer's right to require that a mask be worn or that a vaccination be had. So if you've got a situation, if you're an employer and you say everyone needs to wear a mask, and one of the employees has a medical condition which prevents them from wearing a mask, then you would be required to accommodate that need up to the point of undue hardship. So, and that's quite a simple example. I guess the accommodation part of it in a situation like that would be, could that person work in an office, an enclosed office like I'm in right now, while everyone else was wearing a mask outside of the office? Or could that person do their work from home, as an example? That would be examples of pretty common accommodation for that. It gets a little more complicated around the vaccination issue. So, and I don't have any fact scenarios in mind for this, but I can imagine there'll be maybe the long-term care homes, but at some point when vaccinations are available to everyone, and then you have a situation where a person says, you know, in Alberta, I guess in either province, they could say, I don't want to get the vaccination on religious grounds. You know, what is an employer to do with that? If it's a situation where they really need everybody in the organization to get a vaccination, and there's no reasonable accommodation to the point of hardship there, the person can't do their job at home, for instance. It wouldn't be sufficient if the person wore a mask. And again, very, very fact specific here. But at some point in this analysis on human rights, the employer's needs will trump the employee's right to, in that case, not to have a vaccination. So it's like, and this is why Kelly has rightly put a scale as an icon or as a picture, because in all of these situations, it's an analysis between what the employer's needs are versus the rights of the employee. Okay, so next slide. So as we look at you know, this whole test about whether we get to undue hardship, here is the kind of information that an employer would be allowed to seek from an employee as it determines whether the request to, for instance, not be vaccinated or not wear a mask would rise to the level of an undue hardship. So the employer can ask for medical information confirming that a health condition exists. So obviously just having an employee come in and say, you know, this wearing a mask is going to causing some eczema on my face. You're going to want some medical evidence around that, and not just taking the employee's word for it. You can ask for a medical verification of a negative COVID test. You can ask for a medical verification that a person is could be seriously impacted by having a vaccination. Sometimes, you know, some of the things that go into making up a vaccination can cause an allergic reaction, as well as some immune compromised individuals may not be able to be vaccinated. Again, you would need some medical evidence around that if you're an employer. The employer can ask about whether you've got existing immunity, whether you've had COVID before. I mean, one of the things an employee could say is, hey, I don't need to get the vaccine because I've already had COVID and therefore I've got antibodies. Well, it's fine for the employer to ask for proof of that then, if that's the position that's being put forward by the employee. If someone is saying they've got a religious prohibition around getting vaccinated or wearing a mask or other type of PPE, then the employer is allowed to get some information around that. some sort of proof. I don't know what that would be, but I'm sure it would have to be more than just the individual saying that that's the way, that's the dictates of their religion. Looking into the basis for knowledge, beliefs, or convictions, and that's had to do, I think, more with creed, and evidence of caregiving responsibilities. Sometimes under the heading of family status, one can argue that they're being discriminated against because of the makeup of their family, and maybe with caregiving responsibilities being a part of that. So if that's the sort of the angle that an employee is taking, there's going to have to be evidence around that for the employer. Okay, next slide. Things to keep in mind about human rights and COVID are that there can't be any negative treatment of employees who have or are perceived to have COVID. So I think we've seen some pretty good examples of that in the press so far, but any employer who is disciplining or dismissing because someone's got COVID that's going to be a problem for them. That's going to be a violation of the human rights. Absence policies should not negatively affect employees who cannot work because of COVID. So it would, it's not fair to say if you're away from work for 4 days in a row, you will be dismissed or something like that. There's all kinds of draconian sick day plans that that employers have, and of course this is different. Having COVID, you might not even have symptoms, but having to actually be away for 10 to 14 days on a quarantine because that's required by the provincial health officer. That's not something that you should be negatively impacted on again. No discipline or termination because employees are required to isolate. I just covered that. Accommodate, employers should be working as hard as they can to accommodate caregiving responsibilities, offering flexible options where possible, and don't, I guess as an employer, don't ask for too much information. Because we don't want to burden an already overburdened medical system. So, why ask for a 7-page medical questionnaire when just a quick note from a GP will do?
Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about, actually, oh, did I go too fast? No, I didn't. Is thinking about policy. So we've covered all of the really key pieces of legislation that impact how employers should be organizing things in their workplace, the policies and procedures that they should develop. We've covered the thing, what employees should be aware of as well with respect to work and attending work, what you have to wear for personal protective equipment, and that kind of thing, and what your rights and responsibilities are on both sides of the table. So when we're thinking about developing COVID-related policies and procedures in a workplace, really it is very much tied to the idea of hazard assessment and control that's very familiar to those of you in HR or in occupational health and safety. You're still following through with all of these steps that you would take, and you're just doing it with a particular COVID lens. So you're looking at the types of work that exist. We're doing that hazard assessment first, and we're sort of doing a job demands analysis, looking at each type of activity that's taking place in your work, on your work site or in your workplace, and assessing the level of risk of exposure for COVID, right? So you're kind of doing a job demands analysis, but you also need to be thinking about assessing psychological demands and safety around potential for violence. So you're looking at those activities that are occurring for each job category and assessing it with respect to exposure to COVID, with respect to a change in psychological demands, and also with respect to the potential for violence. And those are really some key things that you should be thinking about a little bit differently than you might have been thinking about before. So you're identifying what those specific hazards might be in those particular roles in the organization, then prioritizing and analyzing those, which is typical for any kind of hazard assessment system, and assigning some kind of measure of the risk that's associated with it. So how much exposure to the public might there be. Obviously, the risk of COVID is much higher for someone in healthcare than it is in a lot of other occupations. There's almost no risk for someone like me right now. I sit at home in my office. I don't go to the university at all anymore because we're just not, there's not a need for us to be there. Our processes, our meetings, everything can occur from home. So for me, that particular hazard is very low. We have, then once you've done that prioritization so that you're making sure that you are addressing that in the different job categories, you implement the appropriate controls. Now, obviously, we know COVID is not going anywhere. So the top of that triangle, that elimination in blue there, is not going to happen. You can probably substitute certain types of work. You can implement engineering controls with screens and that type of thing. And then there are administrative controls, which are things like the social distancing, limiting when people can have meetings and when they can't have meetings, limiting the movement of people in hallways, and then of course PPE at the very tip, which is the last thing that we try to implement, but it's probably the thing we're seeing the most of, are those two types of controls in red that are in that pyramid there, the administrative controls and the personal protective equipment. That's typically what most employers are utilizing to manage COVID in their workplaces. Once you have developed all of those and identified the hazards and developed and implemented those control systems, you need to make sure that you're communicating what the hazards are to your employees and teaching them how to use the equipment that you're asking them to use, because a lot of people are using things that they might not have had to use previously. And of course, as always, we want to be evaluating the effectiveness. So you're keeping an eye. Well, I see my screen changed again. You're keeping an eye on your outcomes and whether or not people have actually been, you know, what your sickness or exposure rates are. So really, in terms of your policy, some really key things to think about, I think, are the hazard assessment. Like I said, assessing the violence and psychological risk that might be different now, and putting in place different methods to deal with those. Consulting with your employees and your unions in the processes and developing those, making sure you're giving as much notice possible of any changes to current practices. Of course, last March that was not possible to give much notice for most people, but try to give the notice now that you have a little bit. We have a little more experience with COVID. We can do that. Providing the equipment and training people. Vaccines. So we've talked here today about mandatory vaccines, but we haven't really talked about the idea of offering incentives. So employers might want to consider offering vaccine incentives and to encourage their employees to get vaccinations if it's a concern in their particular workplace. And then, of course, we also haven't touched much on the pay side of things. So we know when, you know, if an employee is being quarantined or, you know, a lot of organizations, especially smaller organizations, have had to lay off employees. And so there are certain subsidies that are available, and they seem to change on a pretty regular basis from both the federal and provincial governments. But if as an employer you are large enough and able to either supplement or fill in gaps without affecting someone's eligibility for those subsidies, you know, I certainly encourage employers that are able to do that to go ahead and take that responsibility if they can. And then, you know, really thinking about those privacy considerations. It's because everyone talks about COVID so regularly and frequently and it's sort of a constant in every news story, and I think in every workplace there's a lot of water cooler conversation. Thinking about that privacy side of the house is really important as well. The information that you might be gathering from employees, those who may or may not have gotten vaccines, if that's something that is occurring in your workplace, that kind of information is private. So having appropriate protections in place for that medical information that you might be requesting or requiring is crucial as well.